I still remember the day my dad passed like it happened yesterday. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with grief that pressed against my chest every time I tried to breathe normally. I walked into that funeral home expecting pain, sure, but I didn't expect betrayal. My stepmom, who had never treated me like her own, stood there with that same smug expression she always wore. She didn't just ignore me, she outright refused to let me say goodbye to my dad. I froze at the edge of his casket, my heart pounding, words choking in my throat. My dad's hand lay still inside that coffin, and I never got the chance to whisper a single "I love you" one last time. It was the kind of coldness that cuts deeper than any knife. I watched her maneuver around me, her children clinging to her side like loyal little shadows, all perfectly orchestrated to remind me that I was an outsider. Every tiny gesture, every whispered comment was a clear message. I didn't belong here, and yet I said nothing. I stayed silent, holding back the storm that wanted to explode from inside me, because I knew there would be a moment for justice. A week later, that moment almost came at the will reading, or at least that was supposed to be the moment. My stepmom and her children had already plotted to block me from entering the room, using the flimsiest excuse. Only heirs named in the will are allowed. She smirked as she said it, like she had rehearsed the line for maximum cruelty, and I could feel the heat of humiliation rising to my cheeks. I kept my expression calm, my hands steady, and my mind working silently. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I simply kept my plan ready, tucked away like a dagger behind my calm facade. Before I get too far ahead, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Alex. I'm the eldest child of my father, born from his first marriage. Growing up, I always felt like I had to prove my worth, not just to myself, but to a world that seemed to favor my stepmom's side of the family. She came into our lives with a new family, new rules, and apparently, a new version of what she thought was rightfully hers. My dad, as much as I loved him, was often too kind to see her subtle manipulations. That kindness was the thread she pulled to weave her own control, and I had to navigate it carefully for years. The funeral had been the first overt blow, but it was nothing compared to what came next. The week after, every interaction with my stepmom felt like walking through a minefield. Casual remarks were laced with thinly veiled digs. I guess you'll be waiting outside again, or we wouldn't want confusion during the reading. Even her children joined in, glancing at me with the smug superiority only children taught by privilege can master. Each moment was a test of patience, a challenge I refused to fail. When the day of the will reading finally arrived, I knew my stepmom expected me to be absent. She assumed I would let her have that victory, an easy, unquestioned win. I walked up to the lawyer's office quietly, observing the tension in the room, noting the way her smirk had the faint tremor of overconfidence. My hands carried a folder, plain and unassuming, but inside was the document that would shift the entire balance. She didn't notice at first, her attention fully consumed with her imagined triumph. As I stepped closer, the lawyer looked up, a polite nod acknowledging my presence. Mom's eyes flickered at me, a momentary lapse in her carefully curated composure. This meeting is only for heirs named in the will. She said again, this time with a tone meant to cut me off, humiliate me, and assert dominance all at once. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries neither malice nor panic, only quiet certainty. I said nothing. I simply handed her lawyer the folder. The moment his fingers touched the paper, the room shifted. Mom's face drained of color, and I swear I could hear the collective intake of breath from her children, who had never seen their mother so unbalanced. The lawyer, a calm and seasoned man, flipped through the pages, scanning the signatures, the notes, the corrections that clearly established my legal claim. Mom's smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by a rigid mask of disbelief. And that was the moment I realized something important. Revenge isn't always loud. It isn't about shouting or confrontation. Sometimes revenge is quiet, calculated, and delivered at the perfect moment, when the world finally sees what you already knew all along. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to argue. The folder in my hand did all the talking, and in that silence her world tilted. The lawyer's eyes lingered on a particular page, and I could see his subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that everything was exactly as I remembered it. The room grew heavier, though no one said a word. Step, Mom's lips pressed tightly together, her fingers clutching the edge of the table, as if it could anchor her in a world that was suddenly slipping away. I felt no glee in that moment, only a calm satisfaction that justice finally was catching up with arrogance. Her children exchanged nervous glances, the smirks they had worn for years dissolving into confusion. They had grown up believing they were untouchable, that their mother's influence was absolute. Now, seeing her pale, seeing the shift in the lawyer's tone, they realized that the foundation they had built their confidence on was crumbling. I stayed silent, letting them watch, letting them understand without me needing to explain a single word. The lawyer cleared his throat softly, a professional pause that seemed to stretch the tension even further. "This is the original will," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Everything in here supersedes any previous versions." His eyes flicked toward Stepmom, and in that glance I saw the last vestiges of her control evaporate. I remembered the countless nights I had spent imagining this moment, wondering if I would choke, if I would let anger take over, if I would falter. But standing there, watching her realization unfold, I understood that patience had been far more powerful than rage. Revenge wasn't just about winning, it was about timing, precision, and letting the truth speak louder than any shout or argument ever could. Mom's voice broke slightly when she finally spoke, a whisper that betrayed the panic she had been trying to hide. But how? Her words stumbled over themselves, caught between disbelief and the fear of losing everything she thought she had. Her children leaned in, trying to catch fragments of an explanation. But the folder in my hands contained all the answers. The proof of what had always been mine was undeniable, written in my father's own words. I took a deep breath, letting the tension stretch for a few more seconds, then met her eyes calmly. "Everything here is exactly as Dad wanted it," I said softly, my tone carrying the weight of someone who had been wronged but refused to be broken. It wasn't triumph that I felt, it was relief. Relief that the truth was finally out, that the respect and recognition I had been denied were now undeniable. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the folder, but I stepped back, letting the lawyer handle it. He continued to review the pages, confirming each detail, each correction, each clause that had previously been dismissed or ignored. Mom sank into her chair, the color slowly returning to her face, though it was the color of defeat, not victory. Her children sat frozen, learning in real time that arrogance and cruelty have consequences. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Not a gloat, not a taunt, just a recognition that years of careful observation, patience, and restraint had led to this moment. The silence of the room was filled with an unspoken truth. I belonged there. I was acknowledged. And finally, my father's intentions were respected. Even after the reading was officially over, the aftermath lingered like a shadow. Conversations turned into awkward murmurs, and people avoided eye contact with Stepmom, who had clearly underestimated the quiet strength I had carried all these years. Her children, once so sure of their superiority, now regarded me with a mix of awe and caution, and I felt something I hadn't expected, a calm sense of closure, a knowledge that patience, dignity, and careful strategy had won over petty cruelty. Walking out of that room later, I realized that life had given me a lesson far beyond the will itself. Revenge, when done correctly, is not a loud, messy spectacle. It is quiet, deliberate, and precise. It is about letting the truth shine, letting injustice be exposed, and allowing the world to witness what has been denied in the shadows for far too long. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere around my family shifted in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. Mom moved through the house with a tension I had never seen before, her every action calculated but visibly strained. The arrogance that had defined her presence for so many years was replaced by quiet paranoia. I could see it in her eyes whenever we crossed paths, an unspoken calculation, a constant measuring of how to regain the ground she had lost. But this time, I wasn't the scared kid from the past. I was calm, composed, and utterly aware that the power dynamic had finally tilted in my favor. Her children, once so untouchable in their confident superiority, began to treat me differently as well. They tried small tests, subtle digs, and sarcastic remarks, but I met each one with the same calm resilience I had displayed during the will reading. I learned quickly that power isn't always about confrontation. It's about consistency, patience, and letting your presence speak louder than words. Slowly, they realized that the little brother they had always dismissed as soft was no longer someone they could intimidate or manipulate. It wasn't immediate, of course. There were moments of tension, sudden outbursts, and awkward silences at family gatherings. Mom attempted to assert her dominance with pointed comments and thinly veiled criticisms, but each time I responded with quiet composure. There was no shouting, no dramatics, only the unshakable presence of someone who had been wronged, but refused to be broken. The more I stayed calm, the more the family dynamics shifted subtly but unmistakably. People began to see me as a voice of reason, a steady force amid the chaos. During those weeks, I often found myself reflecting on my dad's intentions. I remembered small details he had shared with me over the years, his desire for fairness, his belief in patience and resilience, his hope that his children would treat one another with respect. In the quiet moments when I was alone, I felt his presence guiding me, reminding me that this wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about honoring his wishes and restoring balance in a fractured family. There were a few awkward encounters that I'll never forget. Once at a family dinner, Mom tried to corner me with a friendly conversation about how everything could be smooth if I just let things go. Her tone was sweet, but the edge of threat was clear. I smiled faintly, nodded politely, and said nothing. The truth was already out, the law on my side, and the respect of the other family members quietly reinforced. Her manipulations no longer had the same power. They bounced off me like water off stone. Even her children began to realize that their mother's authority wasn't absolute. They watched, sometimes in disbelief, as I navigated family events with calm, deliberate movements. I made sure to acknowledge small gestures of kindness from other family members, built alliances quietly, and avoided unnecessary conflicts. The shift in perception was gradual but unstoppable, and I could see it forming in the way people looked at me, not with fear or dismissal, but with quiet respect. During this time, I also reflected on myself, the years of exclusion, the silent heartbreak, and the quiet moments of anger I had carried in my chest. I realized that part of my strength came not from the folder I had handed the lawyer, but from surviving those years of neglect and exclusion. The ability to wait, to observe, and to act with precision wasn't just strategy. It was survival, it was growth, it was understanding that true strength often shows itself in patience, not confrontation. One evening, I found myself walking past my dad's study, a room I had always loved, filled with memories of laughter, lessons, and quiet conversations. I ran my hand over the desk where he had spent so many hours, remembering the moments when he had believed in me, even when the rest of the family doubted me. I realized then that the will reading was more than just a confrontation. It was a symbolic reclaiming of respect, love, and acknowledgement that had been denied for far too long. Stepmom's attempts to undermine me continued sporadically, but they were now predictable, weak, and transparent. Each attempt reminded me how far I had come and how much I had learned about human nature, patience, and resilience. Her arrogance had blinded her for years, and now it was her children who had to adapt to a reality they had never anticipated. That I was no longer someone they could dismiss, that my father's wishes were clear, and that the truth always finds a way to shine. I remember when my stepmom first entered our lives. I was barely in my teens, a kid who looked up to my dad and believed that family meant unconditional love. But the moment she arrived, things changed. She carried an air of authority and entitlement, the kind that made every room she entered feel smaller, as if the world had been subtly rearranged to accommodate her alone. At first, I tried to be polite, to bridge the gap, to show her that I wasn't the enemy. She seemed to assume I was. But kindness wasn't enough. It never was. There were small, almost imperceptible moments that built up over the years, tiny exclusions, whispered comments in hallways, subtle rearrangements of plans to make sure I wasn't included. Birthday dinners that coincidentally conflicted with my schedule, holidays that were celebrated without notice to me, casual remarks about my dad having new priorities now. I can remember sitting in my room, staring at the ceiling, feeling the sting of invisibility. It wasn't just that she favored her own children. It was that she worked tirelessly to make sure I knew I didn't matter as much. Even as a teenager, I began to notice patterns. Her manipulations weren't crude or obvious. They were strategic, subtle, and designed to make me question myself. I learned to read the room, to anticipate her moves, and to respond in ways that kept me safe, but never revealed my true thoughts. I became quiet, observant, almost invisible, letting her believe she controlled the narrative while I quietly gathered information, noting every small inconsistency, every hidden agenda, every time she underestimated me. One memory stands out vividly. I was 16, and my dad had promised me a day together. Just the two of us, a tradition we had kept for years. Stepmom had accidentally scheduled her children's activities at the same time, framing it as a minor oversight. I could see the disappointment on my dad's face, and I felt the helpless frustration that comes from knowing someone is deliberately undermining you, yet having no way to stop it. That day, I learned the first rule of surviving with her in the picture: stay calm, observe, and plan for the long game. Over the years, those small lessons compounded. I became skilled at navigating family dinners, school events, and casual visits. I learned to read not just her words, but the tone, the hesitation, the slight twitch in her eyes that betrayed her true intentions. I learned that patience could be more powerful than confrontation, that a well-timed action could be more devastating than years of shouting. Every slight, every exclusion, every smirk added to the foundation for the moment when I would finally reclaim what was mine. Even my dad, kind and loving as he was, didn't always see it. He trusted her, believed in her good intentions, and often dismissed my quiet warnings as exaggeration. I learned not to rely on him to defend me, but to rely on my own understanding of fairness and strategy. And that understanding would ultimately guide me through the will reading, ensuring that every subtle manipulation she had used against me over the years would be laid bare in the quietest, most undeniable way. I also reflected on my relationships with her children. They grew up learning the art of dismissal, thinking that their mother's authority was absolute, and that I could be ignored at will. But as they began to see me act with quiet confidence during and after the will reading, the lessons they had learned from her began to unravel. They were forced to confront a reality they had never anticipated, that patience, intelligence, and timing could overpower arrogance and favoritism. Each small maneuver I had perfected over the years, from staying calm during provocations to observing and noting inconsistencies, culminated in that moment when I handed the lawyer the folder. And in the quiet moments when the house was still and I could think without interruption, I realized that all those early struggles had shaped me into someone stronger than I ever expected. I had been tested repeatedly, excluded, underestimated, and dismissed, but each test only sharpened my ability to respond, to plan, and to act when the moment was right. Those childhood lessons were the secret behind my composure, the reason why the stepmom's smirk crumbled before my eyes during the will reading. In the weeks following the will reading, every family gathering became a quiet battlefield. Stepmom tried to regain her footing, but it was clear that her previous dominance had been irrevocably shaken. Every glance, every word, every move she made was measured, careful, almost desperate. She would smile too brightly, ask questions with forced warmth, and yet the shadow of her failure hung over her like a storm cloud. I could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly when she poured drinks, in the way her voice faltered when she tried to assert authority. Her children, too, began testing the boundaries. At first, subtle jabs, sarcastic remarks about my sudden knowledge of the law, or jokes about how I now had the inside track. I met each one with a quiet nod or a calm smile, never letting them see the satisfaction I felt, never giving them the reaction they craved. Slowly, the lesson became clear to them. Their old tactics no longer worked, and the power balance had shifted. They were learning, as I had learned years before, that patience and strategy outweighed bluster and arrogance. There were moments of tension that I welcomed quietly, seeing them as opportunities to strengthen my position rather than opportunities for anger. At a casual dinner one evening, Stepmom attempted a subtle maneuver. She questioned the seating arrangements as if to test my patience, to see if I would falter and yield. I remained calm, suggested a neutral arrangement that maintained politeness, and let the small power play fall flat. I noticed the slight flicker of frustration in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that her usual tactics were failing. Even outside of direct confrontations, I learned to navigate the atmosphere of tension with subtle gestures. I acknowledged kindness from other family members, offered quiet words of support to those who seemed uncertain, and maintained an air of calm authority that gradually reshaped perceptions. People began to approach me differently, seeking my perspective on minor family disputes, respecting my opinion in ways they had never done before. This shift, imperceptible at first, became more pronounced with each passing week. There was one particular incident that stands out. My stepmom tried to manipulate a casual conversation during a family outing, attempting to cast doubt on my claim to my father's assets. She wove a story full of insinuations and half-truths, expecting me to react emotionally to defend myself publicly. Instead, I listened quietly, asked calm, precise questions that highlighted inconsistencies, and let her words unravel in their own contradictions. By the end of the conversation, her smirk had faded completely, replaced by a tight, controlled expression. Her children, watching in real time, began to grasp the weight of my composure and strategy. During this period, I also reflected on my father's lessons, remembering how he had always emphasized integrity, patience, and the importance of thoughtful action over impulsive reaction. Every interaction, every subtle confrontation became a test of those lessons. I learned not just to react, but to anticipate, calculate, and act with precision, ensuring that the truth remained visible even when others tried to obscure it. Even the extended family began to notice the shift. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had once sided with stepmom began to approach me differently, offering quiet support, nods of acknowledgement, and subtle gestures of respect. They could see, even without me saying a word, that the dynamics had changed, and that the years of quiet endurance had positioned me not as the outsider, but as someone worthy of recognition and respect. These weeks of subtle confrontation and careful maneuvering were more exhausting than any loud argument could have been, but they were far more effective. Each small victory, each moment of calm composure, reinforced my position. I realized that revenge and justice were not just about the dramatic moments like the will reading. They were about the consistent application of patience, intelligence, and moral clarity over time. The moment of full confrontation came unexpectedly during what was supposed to be a routine family gathering. Stepmom, confident in her ability to control appearances, began speaking loudly about decisions she thought she could influence, pointing out minor details about property and family matters as if she still held the power. Her children nodded along, still trying to assert their old superiority, but the air in the room had shifted in ways they didn't notice at first. I watched quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to intervene, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with clarity. When she mentioned a clause in the will that she clearly misunderstood, I stepped forward calmly. Actually, I said softly, but with a confidence that filled the room, the clause reads exactly as Dad intended. There's no ambiguity here. The room went silent. The subtle firmness in my voice caught everyone's attention, drawing all eyes toward me. Her smirk faltered, then vanished entirely. She opened her mouth to respond, but I continued, explaining calmly and precisely, without arrogance, how the will had been written, the intentions behind each clause, and why her understanding was incorrect. Every word was deliberate, every sentence measured, designed not to humiliate, but to reveal the truth with undeniable clarity. Her children's faces shifted from confusion to disbelief. They had grown up expecting me to falter, to be silenced, to react emotionally, and here I was, delivering calm authority that left no room for doubt. Mom's hands trembled slightly as she tried to regain control of the conversation, but the foundation of her dominance had already been shaken. I could see it in the tightness of her jaw, the shallow breaths, the way her eyes darted toward the lawyer's folder I had previously handled. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over everyone. The silence stretched, almost painfully, as family members absorbed what was happening. I didn't need to shout or argue. The truth was visible in my words, in the calm confidence I carried, and in the undeniable documentation that confirmed my rightful position. Mom's facade crumbled in real time, and for the first time in years, I saw the vulnerability beneath the arrogance, the fear, the frustration, the sudden recognition that her manipulations no longer held any power over me. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight and shaky. I didn't realize, the words faltered, incomplete, as if her confidence had evaporated entirely. I let her struggle for coherence, letting the reality sink in without interference. It was not cruelty. It was the natural consequence of years of deception meeting truth. Her children, too, seemed to grasp the lesson. They looked at me differently now, with a mix of awe, respect, and a dawning understanding that they had underestimated not just me, but the principle that patience and integrity can outlast arrogance and manipulation. In that moment, the balance of the family shifted permanently. No longer could Mom or her children dominate the narrative. The truth, finally, had claimed its place. After the confrontation, the room slowly returned to normal conversation, but the undercurrent of respect for my presence remained. Conversations no longer carried the subtle edge of dismissal. Mom's comments became cautious, measured, and far less frequent. Her children stopped testing boundaries with the same confidence, instead observing, listening, and adjusting to a reality they had never anticipated. Later, in the quiet of my own space, I reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The years of subtle exclusion, the silent observations, the careful planning, all of it had culminated not in a dramatic spectacle, but in quiet, undeniable justice. I realized that the real victory wasn't just about the will or recognition, it was about proving to myself that patience, intelligence, and integrity could triumph over cruelty and arrogance. I thought about my father, imagining him watching from somewhere, proud that his child had navigated years of subtle conflict with calm, dignity, and careful strategy. I realized that the revenge I had delivered wasn't fueled by hatred, it was fueled by the pursuit of fairness, respect, and acknowledgement. That made it cleaner, stronger, and far more satisfying than any impulsive act could have ever been. In the days that followed, the household felt different, almost unrecognizable from the tense, calculated environment that had existed for so long. Mom's presence was no longer dominating, her words no longer carrying the sharp edge of control. Her children had grown quieter, more thoughtful and cautious, navigating a new dynamic where respect was earned rather than assumed. And I, for the first time in years, felt a sense of true belonging, not because of wealth or legal claims, but because of the recognition I had finally secured through patience, intelligence, and integrity. I often found myself walking through the house, lingering in rooms that had once felt like territory I could never claim. Dad's study, filled with books, papers, and memories of quiet conversations, became a place of solace and reflection. I thought about all the moments I had been excluded, all the times I had felt invisible, and I realized that each one had been shaping me, preparing me for the moment when truth and fairness could finally prevail. There was a strange comfort in knowing that every slight, every act of exclusion, every manipulation had not defeated me, it had strengthened me. Even interactions with extended family became opportunities for quiet reflection and connection. I noticed subtle shifts, a cousin offering a knowing nod, an aunt pausing thoughtfully before speaking, a quiet acknowledgement of respect where once there had been dismissal. These small gestures, almost imperceptible to outsiders, were proof that patience and moral clarity had lasting power. It wasn't about proving dominance, it was about showing, through consistent action, the strength of integrity over manipulation. Stepmom, for her part, learned to navigate her own limitations. She stopped testing boundaries so aggressively, realizing that the power she had once wielded unchallenged was no longer hers to command. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. The change in her demeanor, her careful attempts to regain composure, were enough. It was a quiet lesson in humility, a subtle reminder that arrogance and cruelty can never replace truth and fairness. As for her children, I noticed their respect growing organically. They began to approach me not as someone to be challenged or dismissed, but as someone who had earned recognition through intelligence, restraint, and thoughtful action. Watching them adapt to the new reality was rewarding not because I wanted to see them humbled, but because it validated the principles I had held onto through years of exclusion. That respect is earned, patience is a weapon, and truth ultimately prevails. Reflecting on the journey, I realized that the real power of this story was not in the dramatic moments, the folder handed to the lawyer, or the sudden shock of Stepmom's realization. It was in the quiet accumulation of small acts, the careful observation, the discipline, and the moral integrity that had guided every decision. That was what had ultimately transformed not only my position in the family, but also my understanding of strength, justice, and resilience. And so, as I sat in my father's study, feeling the weight of all I had endured and overcome, I understood something fundamental. Revenge, when executed through patience and intelligence, is not about malice. It is about balance, acknowledgement, and the restoration of fairness. It is about proving to oneself that enduring hardship with dignity, observing carefully, and acting deliberately can triumph over years of manipulation and exclusion. I closed the study door, walking into the world with a quiet confidence I had never known before. The The family dynamics had shifted step. Mom had learned her limits, her children had gained respect, and I had reclaimed not only what was legally mine, but what was morally and emotionally deserved. In the end, the victory wasn't loud or brash. It was quiet, undeniable, and lasting, a testament to patience, integrity, and the unshakable power of truth. And in that quiet victory, I finally felt free, free from exclusion, free from manipulation, free to honor my father's memory, my own strength, and the principle that justice delivered with patience and clarity is the most powerful form of revenge there is. And as I stand here reflecting on everything, I realize that life isn't always fair, and family isn't always kind, but the way we respond to injustice defines who we truly are. I could have let anger consume me, could have reacted impulsively, could have shouted or demanded recognition, but instead, I chose patience, observation, and careful action. That choice not only reclaimed what was mine, it revealed the strength I had carried all along. I learned that true revenge isn't about hurting others. It's about restoring balance, reclaiming respect, and allowing the truth to shine brighter than any manipulation or cruelty. It's about proving to yourself that no one can take away your worth if you remain steadfast, calm, and principled. My stepmom learned a hard lesson. Arrogance and exclusion may feel powerful, but they are temporary. My siblings and I learned a deeper lesson about integrity, patience, and standing up quietly for what is right. And I learned the most important lesson of all, that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and rises exactly when it needs to. So if you find yourself overlooked, underestimated, or excluded, remember this: patience and clarity are more powerful than anger. Observation and strategy are stronger than confrontation, and truth always finds its way. In the end, the folder I handed to the lawyer was more than paper. It was the culmination of years of resilience, the manifestation of quiet strength, and the proof that fairness, integrity, and patience always prevail. And now, finally, I am at peace, free from exclusion, free from manipulation, and free to honor my father, my family, and myself. This is not just a story of revenge. It's a story of endurance, wisdom, and the quiet power of standing firm. It's a story that reminds us all: justice, patience, and truth can triumph even in the most unfair circumstances, and that is a victory no one can take away.